Hi, this is Brian Birdwell, and welcome to Session 2. In today's lesson, we're going to focus on specific strategies for approaching text completions problems. Last week, we sort of identified the basic process for working these problems. Today, we want to go more in depth. A reminder that step 1 is to read the sentence, yes, of course, and only the sentence. It's very important that you do whatever it takes to avoid glancing at or reading the choices before you have gone through the other steps in the process. It's one of the number one mistakes that students make. We've talked about the various reasons. Just know that this is a very important habit for you to develop as you practice. Do not look at the choices. Read only the sentence. I'll give you a moment to do that for this one. And we'll move on to step 2. Now, last week we described step 2 as finding the clue. This week we want to actually distinguish between 3 elements that will be present in every text completion problem that you work. The target is simply another word for saying, what does the blank refer to? Oftentimes the blank is a modifier of some sort that's modifying a noun or another phrase in the sentence, or oftentimes the blank is a noun that's receiving a modification from an adjective or some other part of the sentence. So it's very important that we get clear on what the target is. The clue, every text completion problem will have a clue, and this is what makes it a standardized test. This is what makes it so that not every single word in the dictionary will fit into this particular sentence. The clue is what gives the blank its specific meaning, its specific flavor. It's very important that you identify the clue before you move forward. And the pivot may not be present in every single text completion problem, but it will be in many of them. And pivots are sort of structural words typically that control the direction of the sentence or control the relationship of different aspects of the sentence to one another. We'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by that. Here, the target is clearly something that the senator has done. So if the senator had only refrained from doing something to these older voters, okay, so our target is something the senator did to those voters. And the specific clue here that we have is that whatever the senator did to the voters, it lost her the election. So therefore, we can think, oh, it must have been a bad thing that she did to the voters. In terms of pivots here, these are sort of non-traditional pivots, and there is a list of pivots in your handout booklet for this session. There's also a list of pivots in the strategy guide that are more common than these. But we could start to see these kinds of shifts of direction in a sentence. If you had not done X, then you would have not done Y. So we can begin to see how these are related to one another, that it carries it in the same direction. If you had not done a bad thing, this other bad thing would not have happened. Now, the next step is arguably the most important step in working text completion problems. However, the benefit derived from this step is really only as good as the analysis that we put into finding the clue. So the more specific you are with your clues, the more readily you can identify pivots and, of course, understand the target for the blank, the better your fill-in word will be. And it's imperative, especially while you're practicing this stuff, that you actually write a target word down on paper. Perhaps by the time you're very well practiced and you take the actual exam, you won't be writing these words down on paper because you won't need to. But early on in your training, when you're really trying to develop the habits that are necessary to perform well on this test, it's our recommendation that you actually write that word down on the page. Now here, I'm just going to say doing something unpopular to. We could also say doing something bad to. You could say upset the voters. Anything along these lines will work. And once you have a fill-in, the next part of the process is very important because it turns out that when put under timed pressure in an exam situation, many of us begin to lose our mental organization. And then a whole other layer of difficulty to the test taking process creeps in. And it's not so much about, or I should say, in addition to being about how large our vocabulary is, how well we understand a given problem, the test is also sort of about our mental organization, whether we're sort of leaping ahead or looking behind at problems that we've already skipped or already finished, and just staying very organized and very clear, knowing which answer choices you have eliminated, for example, can really do a lot to mitigate the effects of time pressure. So what I want you to do for each of these problems is very important that you make a mark on your paper for every answer choice. And you can write A, B, C, D, E, and then make a mark beside A, B, C, D, and E. Even though the test itself doesn't use A, B, C, D, and E, we all know that there are 5 choices, and this is an easy way to represent this on your scratch paper. Alternatively, you can just draw a little 5-space grid or something like that to represent each of the 5 choices. And then you're going to make one of the 4 marks below for each of those answer choices. So it's very important that you mark either a check if you know the word and it's a good match, an X if you know the word and you know it's a bad match, a tilde if you know the word and you think it sort of matches what you're after, and a question mark if you don't know the word. And this is very important that you're honest and forthright in writing a question mark. The middle area of vocabulary, if you consider vocabulary in 3 distinct areas, words that you absolutely know, words that you sort of know, and or think you've seen before, let's say, and then words that you have no idea, that you know you've never seen before and they're just ridiculous. It's that middle category of words that are the most dangerous on the test. So don't give your vocabulary more credit than it deserves in that sense. If you don't know a word, just write the question mark down if you can't define it. So here we know that aiding very clearly is the opposite of doing something unpopular to, so that's an easy elimination. Enervating, you may or may not know. If you don't know, I encourage you to go ahead and look it up. It's sort of, you probably know people who have an enervating effect on you in your work life or personal life. It means to drain energy from. Offending, now we're talking. Offending seems like a pretty good match for something a bad thing to do to voters, so that gets a check mark. Defacing. Now, defacing is interesting because this is sort of a negative word. It definitely means doing something bad to, so that kind of gets a tilde, as in it sort of matches. Like you definitely don't want to deface your voters. I don't know that the word deface actually gets used much in that sense. Typically we deface the wall of a building or we deface an automobile. I don't know that people can actually be defaced. That would be a pretty bad move, I think, as a senator running for office. And the same with disabusing. Now, disabusing, you may not know the exact definition of. A really interesting word. I recommend that you pause the recording and look it up if you don't know it. But we might just say, okay, so disabusing, there's something there about abuse or not abusing. It seems like a bad thing. So we might give that a sort of match. Now, if we don't know this word, very important that we put a question mark there and say that it's unknown. So these are just examples. This test taker, for example, knew the word disabusing, knew that it was sort of a match for what we're after here. The point being that after following through the process, this is what we're left with. 2 words that we know absolutely do not work, 1 word that we know works, and 2 that we think sort of works. Therefore, our choice is clear. The answer is C. We'll select it and move forward. This is the way the process is designed to function. Now, let's look a little more deeply at fill-ins. Again, the better your fill-in, or I should say, the better your analysis of the clues and the targets, the better your fill-in will be. So it becomes very important to identify those things. I'll give you a moment to look at this sentence and see if you can identify a target, a clue, a pivot if there is one, and come up with a good fill-in. Okay, so hopefully you identified here that your target is a quality that the manager possesses. That it's something that this target needs to give us some information describing the manager. Okay, and what kind of information? What kind of description of the manager? This is the function of the clue. And it turns out that this manager talks too much. And how do we know that the author believes that he talks too much? Because it says twice as long as necessary. So we know that his meetings take too long. So notice that when this author says twice as long as necessary, that this is an opinion. This is, in fact, a judgment call. This author thinks that the manager takes too long. And it's very important that you look for this kind of judgment call when identifying a clue. This can be a really helpful way to think about it, that it's someone's opinion that something is too much or too little or good or bad, that there's typically some kind of spin or judgment to the clue that can be very helpful in helping you come up with a good fill-in. It'll also help with answer choice analysis in sentence equivalence problems, which we'll talk about later. So in this instance, again, a pivot, a non-traditional pivot in the sense that the more common pivots are going to be sort of like but, on the contrary, although, however. Those are some of the most common pivots on the test. But notice that these pivots, so blank, that any meeting he led. So there's this quality that's sort of pervasive. In other words, it agrees with the clue. We have a clue that he takes too long, and this is a quality that the manager possesses. Other ways that the pivots can function rather than agreeing with the clue, as they do here, are to oppose the clue. For example, but, on the other hand, on the contrary, however. All of these pivots indicate that whatever follows them is going to oppose or contradict the information that precedes that pivot. We'll also see pivots in sort of a cause and effect relationship to one another. X leads to Y. X results in Y. And we can think of these as pivots as well. So here, a good fill-in, since the meetings take too long, we might think of, okay, he's too talkative, he talks too much. We could also just think slow. And notice how slow kind of fits in there anyway. He was so slow that the meeting takes twice as long as necessary. So slow is kind of a good fill-in here as well. What would happen on this is that using the word slow as a fill-in, we would go through all 5 answer choices and we would find that none of them meant slow. In which case, it's not that our process has failed, it's simply that we need to consider a different fill-in. It's actually an indication that the process has succeeded. Oh, we eliminated all the choices. None of them were a match. So in that case, if that happened, we'd simply go back, try another fill-in. Well, maybe he's not just slow, maybe he's talks too much, is too talkative. And then we could go through the list again, and we would arrive at C, verbose, in this particular instance. Again, the specifics of this word, not as important. What we're trying to communicate here is the process for evaluating targets, pivots, and coming up with a good fill-in. So another thing about pivots is that they can, in addition to being sort of structural words like so, in addition, but, however, they can also come in the form of verbs. So in this sentence here, we have Nick's laxity belied something else. And if we can concretely identify this pivot, then we recognize that belied means it's the opposite. His charm belied the fact that he was really actually a jerk. So laxity belied his something that's the opposite of laxity. So in that instance, we might think of something like being very strict. Of course, we can also have pivots that go the same direction. And these often come in the form of words like, for example, in addition, furthermore. And they can also come in the form of punctuation. So a semicolon indicates that we have 2 complete thoughts that are sort of on the same team, that are related enough that they're expressing the same kind of idea. And this can be very helpful in an example like the one on the screen. If we know that the boom of the 90s ended, then what would happen to these venture capitalist erstwhile darlings? Now, don't be thrown off by this kind of strange language, apace and erstwhile darlings. If the boom ended, What had to have happened, since we know that the semicolon indicates we're moving in the same direction? What had to have happened to the venture capitalist darlings? Well, they must have also ended, or we might say failed. So we can have pivots that go on the same side, so to speak, as well as pivots that indicate we're moving to the other side of the issue. Now, that gets us through sort of a detailed analysis of step 2. Comparing each answer choice also requires some discussion. And also, of course, it's probably clear by now that we're discussing an overall strategy for how to approach these problems. So I cannot emphasize enough that it's about forming habits. Even the easiest problems that you approach, you must learn to approach them deliberately and consciously with these methods so that they become a habit for the way you approach all of the problems on the test. Because there's certain situations that you're going to run into, perhaps like the one on the screen here. So take a moment to read the sentence and go ahead and identify a target, a clue, and a pivot, and come up with a fill-in if you can. Okay, in this instance, we not only have the common pivot, but we also have this sort of time reference, which is common in sentences, to say once or in the past, this is the way things were, and now this is the way things are. When that's connected with the word but, we know that things are different. If it was in the 1920s, things were like this, and now they're like this, with the connecting word and, it seems more likely that these two time periods are going to possess similar qualities. However, if we separate them with a pivot word that goes in the opposite direction, like but or however, now we're suggesting that these two times are very different. So what is the characteristic of the first time period here, the Civil War time period? Well, in that time period, the groups were dormant. And now, but now there's something else. So what's the opposite of dormant? What is our, what's a good word for our target here, which is a description of what the groups are like now? It seems like the opposite of dormant is a good choice. Perhaps the best choice for the opposite of dormant is something like active, since dormant sort of means inactive or, at rest. So at this point, we're moving on to sort of what we formally call step 3, which is comparing each choice, the process of elimination. And this is what I want to mention about this step in the process, that when I have a great fill-in word like active, and what makes it great is that I have easy facility with the word active. I really own that word. I know the definition. It's very comfortable. I know that it fits the sentence. This is the quality of a good fill-in. You shouldn't stretch your brain to try to come up with the most intellectual fill-in possible. You should try to come up with the easiest fill-in that does describe the specifics within the sentence. So what can often happen on the test is with active, I know that Pacific and timid are not active. If anything, they are sort of the opposite of active. But then I can encounter problems as a test taker when I see a word like recrudescent and I have to say, oh, I don't know what recrudescent means. And then I can say, how about recapitulatory? Shoot, I know I've heard the word recapitulate used before. I never use that word in my daily speech. I don't really know what it means. And recriminatory, wow, it looks kind of like criminal. So that may sort of make it appealing in that kind of way, but I really actually don't know the word. So I have to put a question mark there. And this is a point that lots of test takers reach on many problems. You are extremely likely, if not inevitable, to face a situation just like this on the real test. And at this point, the most important thing for you to remember is that you only have a minute to do this. So don't waste time. Here's where a lot of students begin reading the sentence over and over again, just kind of staring at the page, zoning out. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't know the words, you don't know the words. And this is a game, this is just a part of playing the game of the GRE. You don't need to get every single problem right to get a near perfect score. So it's very important that you make the best decision given the circumstance. And the best decision given this circumstance is to stop wasting time immediately, flip a quarter, make a choice, and move on and don't look back. It's very important that you actually select an answer here and move forward. Despite the fact that you can come back and review problems later, you may not have that luxury. You might waste time or use your time on the remaining problems and even forget that you need to go back to this problem and do it. So in that event, since you are not penalized differently for blanks than you are for wrong answers, it's very important that you select something, flag the problem in case you do have time to come back to it later, and move forward without wasting more time. You will miss problems on the GRE. That's okay. It's not okay to miss problems and waste time. The big point for these problems is to remember that there is a clue. There must be something in the sentence that gives it a specific meaning. It's not just some bland, generic word. Not any word will do, but there are specific words relating to the clues in the sentence that give it a very specific meaning. If that wasn't the case, this test wouldn't be standardized. We could just put any old word in the blank that we want and anything would go. So it's part of the nature of the test that there are clues, and therefore we should demand a clue from every problem that we work. It's very important that we don't assume things or add our own ideas to this. Take every problem at face value without adding too much imagination to it. And don't write a fill-in before you've read the entire sentence. And here's why that's important. A somewhat common mistake is that we're so excited, and especially due to the timed pressure, students often don't read all the way to the end of the sentence. And so here, for example, graduating from grad school is a blank time for many students. And all I'm thinking about is how badly I want to be graduating from grad school, and what a relief, how awesome, how exhilarating that must feel. So I might say something like happy or exciting. The problem here is that if I'd read the rest of the sentence, I would see that it's about a recession and growing levels of student loan debt. Hardly things that indicate happiness or excitement. And in light of this, a more proper word for the blank might be something like worrisome or troubling. So just another review of those 4 do's and don'ts there. Demand the clue. Notice that in the first instance, graduating from grad school is a blank time for many students. There is no clue. If that sentence ended at the comma, there's no clue there. There's nothing to give it specific meaning. It could be any kind of time for any kind of student. Therefore, we have insufficient information for coming up with a fill-in. We must demand a clue and look deeper if at first we don't see one, because it must be there. And of course, following the comma is a likely place to find a clue, and of course we do here. Recession and debt, bad things. We need a bad word for the blank, a negative word for the blank, not the positive, happy, exciting. Another aspect of creating a good fill-in, and this is one of my personal favorites, is recycling material from the test itself. So what we find is actually in many instances, the test in the sentence that we're evaluating will actually give us a great word for putting in the blank. And it makes the sentence sound silly when we use the same word twice. But we don't have to bother with whether or not it sounds silly, because what we're after is precision. What we're after is accuracy with our definition. And if they give us a word and we use it again, then we know with confidence that we're using that word properly. So let me give you a moment to consider this problem. And follow through here with the process. Identify target, fill in, clue. And let's have a look at those things. So the target here is some kind of description of the senior managers. So our blank needs to describe or give more information about those senior managers. Okay, great. What kind of information should we be giving about those managers? Well, one thing that we know about them, in fact, the only thing we know about them, is that they are likely to perceive others' motives accurately. Of course, the pivot here is that semicolon. We know it goes in the same direction. It agrees with the clue. So something that means likely to perceive others' motives accurately is exactly the kind of word that we're looking for to go in our blank. Now, we could scratch our heads and we could think of like what awesome vocabulary word means likely to perceive others' motives correctly. And in fact, we could spend a lot of time kind of scratching our chins and staring into space trying to come up with the best word for the blank. But what we need is a phrase. You don't even have to use a single word, just anything that gets the idea across, but not just any idea, this very specific idea of being likely to perceive others' motives accurately. And it turns out that in this sentence, they give us a great word for that purpose. Why not just recycle the word perceive into perceptive? If the one thing I know about these managers is that they are likely to perceive something, then a natural way to describe them would be as being perceptive. Recycling is a very clever move. It's very, very useful. Looking at the answer choices here, we can uncover a. Looking at the answer choices here, we can also notice. Take 3. Looking at the answer choices here, we can also uncover some other aspects of the test. So once perceptive has arrived as our fill-in, we know that fortunate is not the same thing as perceptive. Quotidian, we may or may not know. There's a restaurant chain I know from New York City called Pen Quotidian. I think it exists in other cities as well, probably. And that means daily bread. So quotidian is sort of commonplace or everyday. Intrepid, a great one if you don't remember the definition of a word, but you've seen it before. For example, I know that intrepid is the name of a car. Well, companies don't name their brands or their products after negative ideas typically. So at least if you know that, oh, I've seen a car that has this name, then it's a positive idea of some kind. Intrepid actually sort of means without trepidation in a way. It means bold or adventurous. Garrulous, there are lots of words on the GRE that are used to describe whether people are talkative or not talkative. Garrulous means talkative. And then we'd be left with perspicacious, which actually means to be perceptive almost exactly. Something else that's interesting about these choices, though, that I want to mention is that several of them make sense in the sentence without that clue. So, here it's sort of like senior managers are generally they're more fortunate than middle managers. And even with the clue, we might say that they're more fortunate than middle managers because they are more likely to perceive. So their perception makes them fortunate. Interesting, huh? And with intrepid, it's like their perception makes them braver or bolder. So notice how these actually make some sense, and in many ways, they're more interesting than the correct answer. Just something to note here that the correct answer isn't going to necessarily be imaginative or interesting, but it will be necessary in the sentence. In other words, another word to say that is that it will be clearly indicated by the sentence. So if you are likely to perceive, I know that means you are perceptive without a doubt. This is what the GRE is testing. If you are perceptive, you might also be fortunate. You might also be intrepid, but that's not guaranteed. Whereas if you are perceptive, you are guaranteed to be perceptive. Thus the beauty of recycling when sort of playing the GRE game. Now, what I'd like to do is give you 5 examples here just to practice your fill-ins. So what we want to do here is be very clear in identifying the target, what the blank is giving information about, the clues that lend it its specific flavor, any pivots we can identify, and come up with great fill-ins. So there are 5 problems here. I will give you guys about 3 minutes to check this out. Ready and begin. Okay, let's discuss. Here's what I have highlighted, the clues and the pivots from each of these. Briefly, let's look at number one. Since we must reconsider our positions in light of the culture around us, lest our beliefs become something rather than. Very common pivot here going in the opposite direction. So rather than dynamically reflecting the times we live in, we need something that's the opposite of that. So, what is the opposite of being dynamic? We could come up with several. Here I've got a couple. We could say outdated or ossified. Ossified is a great word to mean sort of to become like bone, to become hard, to become rigid. And if you want to write a phrase like that, lest our beliefs become rigid or bone like or something like this, or non dynamic. You could even just recycle there and say, lest our beliefs become not dynamic rather than dynamic. That would be perfectly fine as a fill in. With number two, preternatural powers that allowed her to blank. So, what do preternatural powers do? Future events. Well, when talking about the future, clearly we mean predict or foresee. The next part is kind of interesting, this list. We have cataclysms and illnesses, two bad things, a pair of nouns here. From two bad things to global booms, generally seen as a good thing, and personal We would also need a good thing here that's very similar to a boom. So, what's a personal sort of boom? Might be a windfall, something like winning the lottery in this instance, a windfall. In her later years, the artist eschewed the wild and chaotic imagery of her early work. Eschewed, you might know, means sort of gets rid of or moves beyond, leaves behind. Instead, and that's the great pivot there, even if you didn't recognize the verb eschewed, instead embraced prim and highly blank formalism. So we need sort of what's the opposite here of wild and chaotic? We might say controlled, we might again say rigid, or we might even just recycle. And if we know that formalism is present, then we know that she's also being formal. Again, an interesting way to recycle these words and therefore sort of take some of the creative energy required for taking the test out. If they give you the word, just go ahead and use it. And then that's that much energy that you can conserve to think of great fill-in words on other problems where recycling is maybe not as much of an option. On number 4, this is a very tricky one for English speakers, people who speak English as their second or third language sometimes, because positively doesn't mean positive all the time or necessarily. In this instance, the president was not just blank, but positively something. So in this instance, positively just means extremely in this form, not just and we need to say, well, what was he? He was either not just nice, but positively saintly, or he was not just, stingy, but positively greedy, or, we need something more specific here, of course. We need a clue, and it comes after the semicolon, the pivot taking us in the same direction. People lived in fear of him. So if they live in fear, then he was not just, scary, but positively terrorizing, something like this. We need the second blank to be a more extreme version of the first blank. So a couple of examples here, we might say not just bossy, since he was the company president, but positively domineering, something more extreme than the first blank. With number 5, neither X nor Y, another sort of two-part list that we want to pay attention to. And because what follows the semicolon here, since we know that this is a pivot taking us in the same direction, is going to be 2 descriptions. And they have to follow the same order that the first part of the sentence does. So the first part that follows the semicolon, surly to the waiter, is going to describe the first blank. So he was neither X, so he was not X because he was surly. Well, what's the opposite of surly? Okay, so if you know surly, then you might say, oh, well, the opposite of surly is something like nice, because surly means rude or gruff. And the second blank is going to get its clue from the second half of that clause following the semicolon. So we can look down at the end. He talked at length about mechanical engineering, which Marissa finds quite tedious, which is another way of saying boring. And if he's not boring, what is he? Well, he must not be interesting. Excuse me, if he is boring, he must not be interesting. So this is how we can leverage that sort of structure of the list, presenting 2 things in order and then giving us 2 ordered clues about those blanks as well. Again, positively, very confusing for some folks that it simply means we could also substitute the words also or even, not just X, but also Y. Again, even in that construction, the second word is going to be a more extreme version of the first. And in the neither nor in this 2-part list, we need to keep them in the same order. So neither X, Y, because he was surly, nor Y. Well, why that? Because she found it tedious. So we can use the structure of the sentence to help us make informed choices for the fill-ins, help us to better understand them. Okay, let's look at filling in when there are 3 blanks. Now, no formal time limit here since we don't have choices, but something less than a minute to check this sentence out and come up with a good fill-in. And one thing that you'll notice As part of the strategy when we're working with multiple blanks is choosing the easiest blank to work with first. In this example, blank 1, numerous tactical what? There really are no clues yet for me to fill in that word. He could make tactical decision. He could make tactical errors. He could make tactical brilliancies. I don't know if he's doing good things or bad things or neutral things with these tactics. I'm going to need more information, including doing something to his forces over too wide an area. And again, it's very important here that we notice this judgment call, this evaluation that it was too wide. Now, if it's too wide, that's a bad thing. So now we can say, okay, well, what kind of tactical, what was he doing tactically? Well, something bad. So then our first blank might then begin to look like something along the lines of mistake or something bad, an error. Now, what can you do to your forces over too wide an area? How, put them over too wide an area, spread them over too wide an area, something like this. Here's another thing that he did bad. He greatly underestimated the effect of the weather. And here's another thing that he did bad. This is really important to recognize that this is all a list of blunders, errors, or mistakes that he's making. And we know this concretely simply because of that too wide an area value judgment there, and also underestimating. So these are two bad things, two mistakes that he has made. These give us great insight into what the first blank will be. So he underestimated the weather, and finally, he appointed leaders due more to blank than to merit. So merit is a good thing. You should appoint your leaders due to merit. What is a bad reason to appoint someone? That turns out to be a more difficult blank, I think, to come up with, whereas we can have errors or mistakes or blunders for the first blank. We could have spreading the forces over, dispersing the forces over too wide an area. With the third blank, we might struggle to come up with what are other reasons, due to what rather than merit. We might say due to camaraderie, due to cronyism or nepotism, if we know that word, due to personal reasons, maybe just because they're his friends or his relatives or something like that. So just make sure that when you're working text completion problems with multiple blanks, you look for the easiest blank to do first, and you allow some of those blanks to help you fill in other blanks as you sort of go through the process. Now, one thing that I always like to remind students is that two blanks can often be better than one, even though it seems intimidating. It seems like you have more to do. There are reasons that this can be actually easier. You don't get partial credit, which is a bummer, so you have to get both blanks or all three blanks correct before you receive any credit. But there are a couple of things that you have to your advantage. One being there are more clues if there are more blanks, and if there are more clues, then there's more information to work with. The other kind of boon for working two or three blank problems is that you only have 3 choices per blank rather than 5 choices per blank when you're only working with one. So these things can actually work to your distinct advantage. Really important when you're working with a 2 blank or even a 3 blank sentence text completion problem, that you stay very, very organized. So I like to recommend that students draw these sort of little tic-tac-toe grids to represent the structure of the answer choices. And of course, as you're going through this, you'll be evaluating them, sort of these 3 at a time. You're going to make a mark for each of those 3, loquacious, taciturn, or elegant, and then you'll make a mark for each of these 3, skew, list, or real. Not necessarily in that order, column 1, column 2, but one column at a time. So one blank at a time is how you are going to evaluate these choices. And again, be sure that you make a mark for every choice that is available. Staying organized cannot be underestimated as value for this test. Okay, so let's just do one. I'll give you guys a little bit of time here to evaluate this one. Now, you might recognize in this situation, Many people feel that the second blank is easier to do first because of this really colorful clue that we have presented there. So, in the first blank, even the most ambitious of parents can experience what when they learn about standardized tests? We really have no idea. They could experience elation, excitement, fear, anger, reluctance. There's any number of things they could experience. But at the bottom, normally polite people become quite something else. So they're normally polite. Now they are not polite. And specifically, how are they not polite? They try to battle other parents. So now we have a great lead as to what kind of word we can put in the blank here. Something along the lines of aggressive or mean in this way. So with number two, there's no pivot. It's got to agree with it. Something battleish. And something battleish most clearly would be, I think, aggressive. And then we can move on to the other blank. And now that we know that they are becoming aggressive, we can much more easily find a word for the first blank. So if the most ambitious, if we know that these parents are often going to become aggressive, well, what are they experiencing then? What are they experiencing that would lead them to be aggressive? And we might come up with a number of words here. We know that it needs to be a feeling related to battling, but who knows what that is? Maybe it's more aggression. We could just recycle that clue that we already came up with and use it again. They experience aggression, often becoming aggressive. No one can deny that that makes sense, that those words would be accurate when used together. Maybe it's also worry, and that's why they become sort of aggressive, because they're afraid or something. So with those fill-ins, we could go to the choices, and I'll go ahead and give it away here. Pause the recording if you want to think about this right now and come up with an answer. Pugnacious is the nearest match to aggressive. A pugilist with that prefix pug is kind of an archaic way of describing a boxer or a fighter. And trepidation is the nearest match we have to an experience related to battling that they might have. It turns out it's not aggression, it's actually fear. So they experience fear, and therefore they become aggressive when trying to get opportunities for their kids. Add these other words to your jot list if you don't know them. Apoplexy, artless is a really interesting word. It doesn't seem to really have anything to do with art, so kind of misleading in that way. Good words to put on your jot list for future use. Okay, let's take a look at a complete three blank problem here. One note is that with the longer blanks, with the more blanks, three blank choices, for some reason, the GRE is more likely to fill in these with phrases, as you can see by quickly glancing at the choices. Even though you're not supposed to do that, just for this purpose, you can see that there are actually several words in some of the choices rather than just one. So let me go ahead and give you about a minute and 10, minute and 15 to evaluate this one, and then we'll discuss. Okay, let's discuss this one. Oh, Galileo. So the first thing to notice that you may notice, of course, is that this is like a paragraph long. There are 3 sentences here. It's going to be very important that we take our time and really deliberately follow a process. Now, notice I say take the time, don't waste the time. Take your time in the sense that you don't want to rush through this, but be very careful not to sort of dilly-dally and waste time and therefore penalize yourself unnecessarily. Even though it has 3 blanks, it might take us a little more than the 1 minute average, which is why I gave you 1:15 for it, but it still should not take something like 2 minutes to work a problem like this. We have to make quick decisions and keep moving forward. So the first sentence has no blank, and it's just sort of background information. A supernova became visible. Okay, great. It was visible in daylight. Okay. Galileo gave several lectures that not only, now this is a great structural word, not only sought to explain the origin of the star, but sought to do something else. So not only explain the origin of the star, but also to do something to the views of many philosophers that the heavens were unchangeable. Now, we might think for a minute, if the views of many philosophers thought that the heavens were unchangeable, well, here all of a sudden a star has become visible. We must be looking at change. So one avenue of getting into this, I think, is through that middle part right there, the second blank, that if obviously the heavens are changing, what is Galileo going to do to the views of people who think that it's not changing? And I think here we have a great fill-in opportunity for something like upset or refute or contradict their views. And it turns out that later in our answer choices, sorry, I don't have a fill-in written on the screen for this one, but that our best choice there is going to be that undermined, that we're going to do something to disrupt their views, to contradict their views, to disagree with them in some way. The third blank is interesting because it's kind of like a one blank sentence text completion problem all on its own. This idea was foundational. Now, what idea are they referring to? They're referring here to the idea that the heavens were unchangeable. So the idea that the heavens were unchangeable was foundational to a worldview underpinned by a central and all-important earth with celestial bodies merely. Now, what could these celestial bodies merely be doing? If the earth is central and all-important, we might even say something like, with celestial bodies merely being unimportant. We might not really know specifically what they're saying, but at least we know that if the earth is central and important, then these mere celestial bodies are going to be not central and not important. And the only available choices that match that, the only available choice that matches that is rotating around it. So they're not central, they are peripheral, rotating around it. Intermittently has nothing to do with it in supporting the theory, even though there's this talk of sort of foundational, underpinned. We have no evidence that these celestial bodies themselves are supporting any kind of theory. And then we'd be left with the first blank and some blank that perhaps it was merely vapor near the earth. Now, this is kind of confusing because we might even be thinking that we need a noun here. It may take a moment to realize that we actually need a verb, that some people are doing something to communicate that perhaps it was merely vapor near the earth. So what do these people do? I might just say saying. Some said that perhaps it was merely vapor near the earth, and the best match for something along the lines of said, of course, is posited. Don't be led astray by enunciated. Just because we're talking about talking or communicating, enunciated is very different from sort of posited, stating that perhaps this supernova is just vapor near the earth. Okay, so that's just kind of a brief look at one with 3 words in it. Something else that I want to communicate before we close today's lecture are traps. There are several traps in the answer choices that you want to be on guard for. You want to always have these traps in the back of your mind because traps in the answer choices can be a very useful way of guessing when we need to, when we don't know all the words, or in eliminating choices when we've failed to come up with a good fill-in or we're otherwise struggling. Even without struggling, looking for traps is just a good idea. It's a good habit. It makes us feel confident, makes us feel like we really know the test and know the material. In this example, I'll give you just a moment to read over it. That we've basically got math, statistics, variables, functions, technical definitions, etc. This is a great candidate sentence for what we call the theme trap. Now, a good fill-in might be sort of incorrectly versus correctly here. This technical definition is lost on those who badly use the word to refer to a limit or boundary. So we know that a parameter is, so we define parameter. Parameter is a quantity that relates functions and variables, blah, blah, blah. This definition is lost on those who define it another way. So this must be a mistake. Incorrectly define the word to mean limit or boundary. This idea would be more correctly used with perimeter rather than parameter. Now, that's just the technical ins and outs of working through the problem, which really wasn't the point here. The point here was to show you that numerically, quantitatively, and skeptically all show up in the answer choices. They sound okay in this sentence if we sort of are plugging them in, and they are strongly associated with the theme or the context of the sentence. Now, these aren't always wrong. It's just very important that we watch for these and that we keep our eye on theme traps and don't fall for them unnecessarily. So we want to say it's okay to select a word that's in the same theme. They're not always incorrect, but very important to recognize those theme words, thematic matches, and we can say, oh, wait a minute, now this is the same theme as the sentence. Is it actually correct or not? Very important trap to watch out for. Another trap to watch out for, actually two more traps to watch out for, are what are called the spin trap and the reversal trap. So on this one, I'm actually going to give you a minute to work through this problem, and then we'll discuss the traps. So 1 minute. Okay, that's a minute for this one. Let's go ahead and check it out. Again, we've used this word belied to indicate our pivot. So Ned's work with children required he affect an amiable demeanor. And this affable, it's great to know here that affable and amiable are synonyms. We also have the pivot but, so lots of pivots here to indicate that we're talking about something else now. He's supposed to be amiable with the kids, even though naturally he is, we might say, anything but amiable. He is something that means not amiable, not friendly. We might say serious. We might just simply say unfriendly in the blank and mark it this way. What's important here is that vengeful and pessimistic both mean bad things. So if we're just thinking, oh, we want something that means not friendly, amiable, or affable, we want the opposite of that. Yeah, vengeful, that sounds pretty good. It's really easy for students here to choose answer choice A and move on without really considering the rest of the choices. And what's interesting here is that, yeah, sure, they're in the ballpark. Like vengeful definitely is not amiable, But this sentence doesn't give us anything specific to suggest that he's going to be seeking vengeance, which is the specific meaning of vengeful, or that he has sort of a negative outlook on the world, which is what pessimistic suggests. So while these are negative words, meaning they have the same spin as the words we're looking for. So spin is positive or negative. We're looking for a negative word here. These words have the same spin, but their specific meaning is not close enough. So a lot of students here, we find situations where they want to choose one of these close words simply because they're not familiar with jocund or standoffish or even cordial. They don't recognize some of these words. So we really have to emphasize that you overcome the fear of words that you don't know. It's okay, in fact, encouraged and often a successful strategy to choose words that you don't know on the test. And that's kind of takes a leap of faith that you'll only get more comfortable with through practice. Cordial is interesting here because if you read this sentence too quickly and you only see amiable and affable, you'll be thinking nice, sweet, friendly. And if you don't recognize the pivot, then you'll be very, very likely to choose cordial here in this instance. So those are three traps to watch out for: theme, spin, and reversal. And of course, these are also discussed in the strategy guides. So just to review here, the strategy is to read only the sentence, process the question before you look at the choices. This cannot be overemphasized. Do not look at the choices before you evaluate the sentence. And then, of course, we're going to find targets, clues, and pivots. We're going to write our own fill-in to best match the answers. When writing that fill-in, you can use phrases and simple words. You don't have to use advanced vocabulary, anything that gets the idea across, and always be willing, in fact, experiment with recycling, because recycling is such a useful strategy here. When eliminating, make sure you make a mark for every choice. This is not only helpful for staying organized in the experience of the test itself, it's also a great way to review your homework. If you've actually made a mark for every choice, then when you go back and look at the problems you've done, you'll know better where you went wrong. Also, don't be afraid to choose a word that you don't actually know. And if you don't know lots of the words, make a decision and cruise. Keep moving and don't waste your time. Now, just to finish up with our lesson today, we're going to do some problems. So these are going to be timed. I'm going to be asking you to follow through with the process, and then I'll just be giving a short explanation to follow. So here's number 1. And I will give you 1 minute. Okay, that's time is up for this one. I think here the biggest clue is this aspect of little ground. So if something happens, if these retailers do something to these deficiencies of the new inventory system, then its inventors will have little ground on which to make a case for its adoption. So if I'm not going to make a case for its adoption, then what must the system be? If I'm not going to be able to make a case for its adoption, then that new inventory system must be bad. It must not work in some way. And so what would the deficiencies of that new system be? If I'm going to have no ground to stand on in recommending it, then I must have lots of deficiencies, or at least large deficiencies, something along these lines. Now, the first blank is a little more bland. If the retailers do what? The deficiencies of the new dynamic inventory system to be large. If they find that they are large, if they determine that they are large, perhaps if they consider the deficiencies to be too large or to be large, any of these would work. And our correct answer, as long as you're in the ballpark there, you're doing well. And with these two fill-ins, consider and large, our best matches are determine and significant. Any words here that you don't know, like traduce, be sure you write down on your jot list, Google it, look it up, make a flashcard, and learn it for next week. How about this one? I will give you 1 minute to approach, and then we'll have a quick discuss. This is a great problem for recycling as a strategy. It's a very tricky double negative at the beginning of it here, although it was not assumed that the terrorist group had never considered. That can be kind of tricky to make sense of. Considered what? What did they not assume that the terrorist group never considered doing to a military facility? At least we can identify the target here, that we want a word that suggests we're doing something to the military facility, these terrorist groups. It's the giveaway follows the comma. The possibility of such an attack. Wait, we haven't mentioned an attack yet. So it must be that the terrorist group had never considered attacking a military facility. And that's where we sort of get our clue as to the specific meaning of this blank. The possibility of such an attack was considered what by most experts? Because of the terrorists' limited resources. So, since the terrorists have limited resources, such an attack must have been considered unlikely or small. The possibility was considered small. Why? Because they didn't have any resources. And the best matches for attacking and small are, of course, attacking and remote. And let's move on. I will give you 1 minute for this one. In this sentence, we have a pivot actually kind of beginning it, just like we did on the last sentence. The last one began with although. This one begins with though. Though some suspect that the box belonged to Frida Kahlo, comma, think of what we could expect to follow this. Though you suspect the box belonged to Frida Kahlo, I, on the other hand, think that it belonged to Diego Rivera. So it's going to be a contradictory opinion, something else. Though some suspect this, most observers would agree that it did not belong to Frida Kahlo, in other words. So that its true what would be unknown. Its true owner is still unknown, perhaps, or its true origin is still unknown. Either of these work as good fill-ins, and of course with origin, we can quickly eliminate affinity, antecedents. Conception is close, kind of in theme, but we're not actually looking for where it was created, just looking for where it came from, who owned it. An enigma, of course, is not a match. Provenance, our best answer here. Look them up if you have questions about the definitions of the words. The most important thing here is that you're identifying the useful clues and pivots within the sentence and that you're working to come up with a fill-in. I think coming up with a fill-in is pretty hard early on in GRE training. So it's, again, just important that you build the habit, that you develop the discipline to actually commit to a fill-in word. And you may be bad at it right now, and you will get better and better and better only by practicing. You won't get better necessarily just by listening to my fill-ins. You're going to have to practice and work with your own. Let's try another one. Okay, so a minute may seem like it passes by very quickly on a two blank question. A minute's just the average. If you want 10 extra seconds here, go ahead and pause the recording and give yourself that extra time. We use the 1 minute interval just to get accustomed to the idea that they should all be taking you around a minute to do. Very, very far from 2 minutes, in other words, which is what many students tend to move toward. And getting just fast at these things is very, very important, that you learn to push yourself to go through the process quickly so that you have time for the more time-consuming reading comprehension problems later on. In this particular instance here, the biggest clue, I think, is inversely linked. If you saw that the semicolon is a pivot here, extra bonus points for you. If hard work and success are inversely linked, this means that the more we have an X, then the more. Now, what's interesting is inversely linked typically means that something goes up and the other thing goes down. So we're going to have to be very careful here to sort out the meaning that something is going up, an employee does something more, then this other thing should go down. But they're actually using the modifier more. So we just have to kind of switch the meanings in our mind. So notice also in the very beginning, we can recycle the words that they've already given us. So if we know, for example, if we know that hard work and success are the two items being discussed here, then in the first blank, we can go ahead and put works hard. This is a great recycling example. So the other one needs to be something about successful. But the more blank we become in the company's petty power struggles, the more successful we become in the company's petty power struggles. Notice the word petty there is negative. We don't actually want to be successful here, and we're trying to indicate an inverse link. So hard work goes up, success goes down. So we need a word here that describes having bad success by becoming something in the company's power struggles, especially the petty power struggles. So what would it be a bad thing to do with company power struggles? One way to express this is to say caught in them, or stuck in them, or entangled in the company's petty power struggles. And with these two fill-ins, a great recycling word, and then or a recycled word, and then just a heads up sort of evaluation of what kind of word we need in the second blank leads us directly to strives and enmeshed, both of the middle guys here being our correct answer. Remember this overall pattern, though, of the sentence, that the more X we have, Y happens. And there's kind of a tricky play here on the phrase inversely linked and then using more and more. So we want more hard work and less success. But we need to express less success with more something in regards to the petty power struggles. Okay, let's keep cruising. I'll give you a minute for this one. And a little extra, since it's 3 blanks, let's give a minute and 15. So take a moment and consider whether you actually found this 3 blank to be more difficult or more time consuming than some of the 2 blank or even 1 blank questions that we've seen in the past. There's not always a concrete, there's not always a proportionate increase in difficulty or time. You may find that some 3 blank questions are easier and faster than some of the 2 blank or even 1 blank questions that we've approached or that you approach in the future. Here, a student paper is considered to have been plagiarized. Now, that's a great clue right there. When text appears, what from a source? Well, taken from a source, appears exactly as it did in the source. And what kind of source? A source that has not been properly what? When we plagiarize, what are we failing to do to a source? Typically, we're failing to credit that source or credit that author. So credit, or you might even have gone directly to cite here as your fill-in. We could also say appears exactly the same from a source that has not been properly credited. But here's the pivot. It's harder to draw a line in the sand in cases where a thesis and organizational structure. So the pivot, not that important for us here because the pivot's just sort of, it's distinguishing from the paper or the text itself and the organizational structure. But it's just saying that it's harder to understand what's plagiarism when no intact strings of words, but just the structure have been what from another author. Here, we're still talking about plagiarizing, so we must be talking about taken from another author. Hopefully, you had fill-ins that were at least similar to these. Of course, the best matches are verbatim, cited, and lifted. Now, some people may not know that lifted is almost another word for like pickpocketing or something. Lifted your wallet. My wallet was lifted on the subway the other day. That this is one definition of the word lifted is actually stolen. Okay, let's keep going. Just a couple more here. We'll give you 1 minute for this one. This one, an interesting one for the vocabulary word innumeracy. That one probably not very common. Illiteracy is its well-known relative. Illiteracy being the inability to read. Innumeracy meaning lacking in math skills. No math. So even if we don't know that word, though, we can still do well on this problem. One author argues that innumeracy has become practically blank. Okay, so this gives us no clue whatsoever, where the clue must follow the comma. Affecting society's basic ability to process news and debate issues involving large numbers, such as scientific discoveries and budgetary controversy. So, what we really have here is affecting society's basic ability. And so, if we have something that's affecting all of society, what is one way of describing what it has become? If its notable attribute is that it is affecting all of society. We might say widespread, but we want something even bigger than widespread. We might say universal, we might say everywhere, or we might come up with a good word like epidemic. Either way, we're describing something that it must be very large in scale if it's going to affect society's basic abilities. Therefore, we will arrive at a correct answer of pandemic. Note the theme trap with algebraic, just because we seem to be dealing with numbers. There's a theme trap here. Omnivorous, really nowhere close. Gargantuan is really the only other sort of answer choice that's in the ballpark. That it's become very, very large, very widespread. However, gargantuan is a little too specific here in size. And it's not just the size of innumeracy, because actually innumeracy is like a quality, it's a condition. So it's not necessarily the size, like it's not that the flu gets bigger, it's that it has a wider impact. And pandemic is much more closely related to having a widespread impact than simply being large, like gargantuan. Okay, this is our next to last one. We've got two more, so take a minute for this one. Okay, here we have some critics. Aver might at first look like a misprint or a typo to you. If you don't know that word, put it on your jot list and look it up. If we don't know the meaning of that sentence, aver, the genius, blank, one of one's vices. It's simply something that critics are saying. It's almost like posit, they're positing, or even transmutes them into virtues. So, genius does something to your vices, or even transmutes them. Here, very important that we recognize the pronoun them is referring to vices. So transmutes them into virtues. That's the biggest clue we have here. Even transmutes them into virtues. So making something good of my vices. So genius must be doing something to my vices, even making them virtues. So a good fill-in here might be to, say that it forgives your vices, or it makes your vices good, makes good one of your vices, transforms into something good. That's kind of a long phrase, transforms into something good, but it could still work there. And now we have a semicolon. We're going in the same direction here. The pivot is continuing on, no true pivot into a different direction. In this view, a brilliant artist is principled rather than disputatious, or passionate rather than. Now, what would be the negative way of saying passionate? I can't really think of it maybe off the top of my head, so I could just write passionate in a bad way. Notice this recycling with the new added spin that I need. A good thing rather than a bad thing. Passionate rather than passionate in a bad way. And when we get to our choices here, forgives your vices. Best match there is absolves you of the vice. And passionate in a bad way here is not enamored. That just means has sort of a crush on, enamored with an idea even. That's not the bad spin, the negative spin that we want. Licentious gives us that negative spin for passion that we're after here. Okay, last one, you guys. I know it looks like a beast. It's 3 blanks. There are phrases in there. So let's go ahead and give a minute and 20 for working this one. So while this one does appear to be longer than the others, I think you'll find that there are plenty of clues and pivots here that can help us gain a foothold in understanding it. The first one is with while right here. Very important pivot word. That while Don Giovanni is considered to be his greatest achievement, these people, okay, so it's his greatest achievement, but these people were what? We should say were, nonplussed, did not like it. How about, not convinced, something like this. The opera mixed traditions of moralism with those of comedy. This was heretofore unknown among the composer's works, creating a production that was not well liked by what? Vietnamese, not Vietnamese, Viennese audiences. We need something here that describes Viennese audiences. And what kind of Vietnamese what kind of Viennese audiences? The opera mixed traditions of moralism with those of comedy. This had never been done before, therefore it's something new. And these guys are not liking the new. So we might say this could be something like traditional. Um, with the third blank, meanwhile, however, it was performed, we might say, successfully all over Europe. Because we know that despite the fact that these guys don't like it, all over Europe he's getting great reviews. So even with just fill-ins for the first and the last, though I think traditional would probably be a good fill-in for the middle one, look what we can do with the problem. So not convinced, the best one there is ambivalent at best. Stoically unequivocal. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, actually. To be stoic, maybe they were stoic. It was his greatest achievement elsewhere, but they were sort of not letting in on their emotions. But unequivocally stoic, or stoically unequivocal means you're politicians equivocate, right? Unequivocal just means to be very direct, to actually answer the question. Has nothing to do with this particular sentence. Placating to a fault is far from what they were doing because they're not placating him. They didn't like it. And in the middle one here, Catholic, too specific, definitely not eclectic because they didn't like the mix. So conservative is our best match here, especially if we had traditional or something along those lines as a fill-in. And with the final one, Don Giovanni was performed and liked throughout Europe. The best here, or performed with success throughout Europe. To much fanfare is our best match here. So thanks for sticking around for that drill, and I will see you again in session 3.